Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. And welcome back to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. Today we are talking about studying the Bible as an historical document as opposed to an article of faith, something that biblical scholars generally aim for. This is obviously easier for academics who are agnostic, atheist, or follow a different religious tradition. But how do Christian scholars treat their own religious text as the object of academic study? And does this make them any less of a committed Christian? Before that, though, Bart, hi, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. We started classes this week, and I'm teaching 2 undergraduate classes. For me, they're small classes, 24 students each. One is just first-year students, and one is for anybody. But one is on Christianity in the second and third centuries, which I love. The other is Jesus in scholarship and film, which I love. And the thing is that I've had a lot of colleagues over the years who think that. Who look on teaching as kind of the way that they can get into the research. Like they do it because it allows them to be research scholars. And I've never seen it that way. I mean, I obviously love research, but for me, teaching undergraduates is the perk. This is the perk of the job. And it's just so much fun. And so, so I'm having a great time with it. So how about you?
I wanted to ask first, do you get a decent mix of students from across different disciplines when you teach these more general classes?
Yeah. Very few religious studies majors. A number of students are just taking it because they're interested in the topic. And in my class with my first year students this year, I actually asked them, I said, how many of you were warned not to take this class? About 6 people raised their hands. And then 2 of them told me that they were in high school. They were in a Christian high school. There were different students, didn't know each other, different schools, different parts of the country, or whatever. And they had been in their education in high school, they had been in one of the classes, they had been assigned to read one of my essays and to respond to it. And so, wow,
Amazing.
really? And so I said, why are you here? They said, yeah, well, I didn't like that class very well. So, okay, yeah. So how are you doing?
Yeah, good. Everything is ticking along quite nicely. Kids are all back in school. Everyone is, fingers crossed, healthy for the minute. And I'm planning Akkadian classes for next semester, starting in the winter. I've got a 6-week intro to Akkadian class to teach, which,
No, you had mentioned that before.
yeah,
And
I'm excited about.
so is it a lot different from Sumerian?
Yeah, completely different. It's next door to Hebrew as well. It's a Semitic language, so they work very similarly, but Sumerian is totally unrelated. It's usually recommended, though, that if you're learning Sumerian, you have some understanding of Akkadian because there are like cognate words
Yeah.
and the same signs kind of get used logographically, so that does help.
Yeah.
But no, grammatically speaking, they're totally distinct.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah,
It's
it's
kind of
gonna be
like,
fun.
it sounds kind of like Greek and Coptic in a way because, Coptic uses the Greek alphabet, but
Mhm.
the grammar is nothing related, but there are a lot of loan words, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that sounds very similar.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So, all right, then we should get stuck in. So, we've spoken before, I think almost a year ago, about your own religious journey. And for most of your early career as a New Testament scholar, you were also a practicing Christian. For you, what impact did your faith have on your scholarship? And did that impact change as you moved away from kind of evangelical fundamentalism?
Right. So I started out started out being interested in the Bible, particularly after I'd had a born again experience in high school and became a committed evangelical. And for me, the point of studying the Bible was to understand God's word. And so there was no sense that you were going to challenge it or like disbelieve anything in it or question anything in it. It was a matter of knowing it and learning what it really meant. That did involve some scholarship because to know what a first century writer meant when writing in Greek, you've got to, even if you don't know Greek, you've got to learn at least what the meaning of certain Greek words would be and what they meant in their historical context and how they're used more broadly in the environment. And so it does require scholarship, but it's not a kind of scholarship that where you would question anything. Um, it was more important to memorize the Bible than it was to kind of analyze it deeply, because it was God's word. And that's how I started out.
How did you move from that then to a more critical approach?
So I went to the Fundamentalist Bible College, Moody Bible Institute, and that's all we did is basically study the Bible and related topics. But when I went to Wheaton College, I majored in English and started being trained in literary analysis. And I started taking classes in cultural history of the West, and I would be dealing with philosophy and history and other topics that were I didn't see at the time as particularly related to my biblical scholarship, but after a while I started realizing that a lot of these things actually are relevant. When I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, that's a Christian seminary. It's a Presbyterian school training Presbyterian ministers. The faculty are, I suppose, virtually all uh, Christians, and I'm sure they're all Christians, and many of them are ordained ministers, but they're serious scholars, and they didn't have a fundamentalist view of things. They had they recognized, they were scholars who recognized, look, there are historical problems of the Bible, and being responsible theologically means accepting the truth for what it is and not pretending it's something else. That you can still be theologically responsible and completely committed to Christ and the church and recognize the historical problems of the Bible. It took me some years to get used to that because I thought these people are a bunch of liberals. What do they know? um, but eventually I started seeing the wisdom of that.
And once you kind of made that shift, did it have any difference on your scholarly, like your views or your conclusions as an academic?
Absolutely. Um, I mean, I remember some clear moments when I guess maybe when I was a senior in my Master's of Divinity program, which is the program that trains people to be ministers. But a lot of people then were taking the Masters of Divinity so that they could go on and do a PhD, and that's what I was doing. My senior year, I was taking a seminar on the Book of Acts, the account of the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman world, where Paul is a key figure. And one of the things we were doing in that seminar was comparing what Acts said about Paul's missions and his teachings and his life, and comparing with the things that Paul said about the same topics. When there's overlap between what Paul says about something in his life and what Acts says about his life, we're comparing them, and it suddenly went on like a light bulb to me that Acts can't be accurate in these portrayals because of certain discrepancies. And more important, I realized why he was changing things. He the reason his changes reflected perfectly well his own agenda, as could be seen in other passages. And so I began to realize that Acts is writing history in a way to reflect his theological beliefs, um, rather than simply writing, what actually happened the way it happened. And that applied, of course, then to the Gospels and everything else. So the conclusions that I was drawing at that point, finally, were quite different from what I could have drawn earlier. Because if you think the Bible has no mistakes of any kind in it, then Acts has to be historically accurate.
So, kind of related to how you started out, your views when you started out as a Christian academic, it gets argued that people who aren't Christians can't truly understand Christianity in a way that Christians can, and by extension, then the New Testament. Obviously, you're now an agnostic and also an expert in the New Testament and early Christianity. So, like, what's your opinion on that viewpoint?
Well, I think it's completely wrong. People. That's one way to kind of safeguard the faith, I guess. If you're confronted with scholarship, historical scholarship, one way to say it was that's just not Christian. If they were Christian, they'd see the truth, and you obviously can't understand Christianity unless you're doing it from the inside. And so I recognize that understanding, and I appreciate it because it was a view I used to have as well. Um, but I don't think it's true. Um, One reason I don't think it's true is because many of the views that I have now, the historical views I have now, I acquired when I was a committed Christian. I wasn't a fundamentalist, but I still believed in Christ for salvation. I still believed in God. I mean, I was still a Christian, but I realized that if the Bible has problems, it doesn't make any sense to stick your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't. It does have problems, but that has no bearing on the question of whether Christ died for my sins or not. People think it does, but it doesn't. And so the views I have now as an agnostic atheist about the Bible are many of them are just the ones I acquired while I was still a Christian, um, and others of them are built on foundations of things I had when I was still a Christian. And when I have arguments with my scholar friends who are still committed Christians about the Bible, we're completely on the same grounds. They never ever say, well, yeah, you can't understand because you're not a Christian. They understand perfectly well what historical scholarship is, and they do it. It's just that, they have other reasons to believe, and I don't.
What then do you think about people who insist that, as well as being, you have to be Christian to understand the New Testament, you have to also have the guidance of the Holy Spirit? Because that's something
Yeah,
that I have seen a few times.
I know, me too. And, and to be told that, well, you can't know because you don't have the Holy Spirit, and, we do. Yeah, okay. I mean, I used to think that too. It doesn't make any sense to me on kind of an empirical level. Just on an empirical level, if having the Spirit is what is necessary to understand the truth, then why is it that all these people who have the Spirit don't agree with each other about the truth? I mean, if the Spirit guides people into all truth, is he guiding people in completely opposite directions? Because, allegedly Spirit-led interpreters are completely at odds on major issues. And so it doesn't look to me like there's any evidence that the Spirit leads people into truth. It seems to me that people, want to say that the Spirit does, or maybe they feel the Spirit does, or they're completely convinced the Spirit does, but it doesn't seem to be right. And often people who don't have the Spirit come to the same conclusions as the people who do have the Spirit, and often the people who do don't agree with each other. So it doesn't make any sense to me.
How then can or should Christian academics go about understanding a text that they hold to be divine, that they hold to be maybe influenced by the Holy Spirit or inspired by, or however you
Yeah,
view it?
yeah.
As how should they investigate it in an historical manner to be responsible scholars?
My mentor in my PhD program, Bruce Metzger, was a very devout Christian. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister, had a very traditional upbringing, and had a very solid belief in the Bible as inspired. Um, he did not think it was inerrant, though. He thought that God wanted people to use their intelligence in order to examine His Word. And Metzger had interesting ways of dealing with the issues that scholars deal with. I mean, I remember quite clearly him talking to a large class one time about the Book of Genesis and the creation stories and Adam and Eve, and he was quite clear that he thought these were myths, that they were not things that actually happened historically. But then when, a student objected, well, you can't say that the Bible has myths in it. And Metzger's reply was, well, I don't think that we should tell God what kind of literature he inspires. Why can't God inspire myths? And um, so he was doing his scholarship while he was retaining his Christian belief, and it just kind of altered the way he looked at it. Instead of saying that God can't do this, that, or the other thing, he's saying, "Look, the reality is this is what it is, and so God can do it. Why can't He do it?" And so there are ways to do it and remain faithful to the tradition, to the faith. Might mean you have to kind of change the faith, but it would be I I I don't think it's a good approach to just to think you can't do historical research if you're going to be a Christian.
So, when you were moving away from Christianity, how did you deal with that kind of issue?
I was because I was so committed to the Bible as an infallible guide to life and to belief. For me, it was emotionally wrenching thinking that there might be historical realities that conflict with what you find in the Bible. Um, and I was troubled by it. And I worried about my salvation. I worried about being wrong. I worried about offending God and all of that. But I took comfort in an idea that had been that was advanced by Saint Augustine. I wasn't particularly interested in fifth century theology at the time. I was interested in the Bible, but Augustine, one quotation that's frequently made of Augustine is him saying that all truth is God's truth. In other words, if something is true, it comes from God. And so you don't have to be afraid of it. You don't have to pursue it. And if you do it intelligently and honestly, without, it's not that you don't go into it. I didn't go into it wanting to trash the faith. I wanted to know the truth because I thought if it's true, then that's what God thinks. And so I decided I just can't be afraid of going where I think the truth leads me. And it doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with what my teachers at Moody Bible Institute said. It might mean looking at the evidence and just seeing for myself what it looks like. And people always objected to me for this, and they say, "Look, you shouldn't argue with God." And my line was always, "I'm not arguing with God. I'm arguing with you. I don't think you understand the truth." And they say, "Well, I don't think you." I say, "I got it, but let's look at the evidence and see." Instead of saying that that I'm arguing against God and you're on God's side, that's not a very helpful argument.
Do you think there are some factors that make it more likely that one's religious convictions can adversely impact your scholarship?
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, uh, it's funny because it's the flip side of what we were just saying. Because some very conservative Christians would say, "Well, if you're not a Christian, you can't understand this." But other people say, "Look, if you're such a committed Christian, then your belief might get in the way of understanding the reality," and that's absolutely true. I mean, it's true of every religious tradition. Christians would acknowledge that this is true of other religious traditions. Christians always say that Muslims, for example, are don't really just they're just blindly accepting what somebody tells them because it's obviously not true. Or I know a lot of evangelical Christians who say that these Mormons, man, they don't, I don't, they're just going on the basis of what they're told in their church. They're not actually looking at this very intelligently, the Book of Mormon or whatever. And so when it's the other tradition, it's easy to see. It's very hard to see it in your own situation. That's the difficulty. How do you recognize that your own assumptions, your own about anything, but here we're talking about religious assumptions. How do you protect yourself from having religious assumptions determine your conclusions? Because if your conclusions have to match your assumptions, then your assumptions are determining your conclusions. That just means you're arguing in a circle. You're not looking at evidence. You're just trying to find a way to make yourself right for what you already think. And so the big step that's very, very hard for people to do. I encounter this all the time with my undergraduates. It's really hard to bracket what you personally believe and just try to look at the evidence that you find. Um, and sometimes it takes years for somebody to be able to do that. But once they do it, they realize, oh wow, yeah, I see it now.
So, do you think there are some Christian traditions or educational trajectories that make this like easier, maybe for some academics to do?
Mm-hmm. My sense is that it's especially hard for people who are in the evangelical tradition who believe that the Bible is without mistakes. It's harder for them to come to realize that there's a contradiction between this gospel and that gospel because in their view there can't be contradictions. People grow up in mainline churches, who might be Episcopalians or Lutherans or Methodists. They tend not to be as troubled by that kind of thing. The point I'll make though, it's a point that came out of my first year seminar yesterday where students were talking about what they saw as the difference between studying the Bible in or studying Christianity, studying religion in a church context versus doing it at a research university. And typically what kids say at this state is they say, well, in university they're objective, and in church they're just believers. And they're usually saying that because they grew up in church and they always heard the same line, and they realize they're going to hear other lines now. But then I always ask them, so you think that like university professors don't have any biases? They say, well, I guess you have some. Yeah, oh boy, do we have biases. I mean, like, everybody has biases. This is not a question of how to be unbiased. You cannot be unbiased and be a living, breathing human being. You're going to have biases. The question is, how do you approach a question and do your very best to bracket your biases so that you're willing to realize that you've been wrong about something you really believed before? That's hard to do, but you can do it. You can do it. And it doesn't mean you have to change your mind, but you're open to changing your mind. My view is that a lot of scholars don't even do that. Biblical scholars, they just can't bring themselves to bracket their assumptions, especially biblical scholars who are preaching, saying the stuff that they grew up on in Sunday school. They're saying, all of their scholarship demonstrates that they were right when they were 12. And I don't know. It seems funny to me.
So that tension of believing one thing and having historical evidence that kind of pushes back or challenges your personal beliefs is kind of like a cognitive dissonance. It makes you mentally uncomfortable to hold those two things together, and it's hard to do.
Yeah.
Do you think that maintaining a Christian faith while studying the Bible in an academically rigorous and responsible manner requires that level of cognitive dissonance, or is it actually not as complex as I'm making it out to be?
It is complex, and I think what happens frequently, not just among scholars, but certainly among scholars, but also among lay people, is that they'll see something that they realize, wow, if that's true, then boy, that's going to really affect how I see things, and I don't know if I want to go there. And so what they do is they find other scholars who have looked at the same problem and have come up with kind of a quasi convincing explanation for it, and they latch onto it. Oh yeah, well, so and so, at Oxford says this, and so yeah, so there's not a problem, and so they appeal to authority, and that happens a lot among scholars, where they'll just they realize, God, this would be a problem, and they solve their cognitive dissonance. So for people who don't know, the idea of cognitive dissonance is that you've got a cognition, you've got an idea in your head that you're really, really committed to, that could be disproved. And when it looks like it is disproved, dissonance breaks in, that the reality is dissonant with your cognition. And psychologists since the 1950s have shown that what happens then is you have a mental mechanism to accommodate it somehow. And so you accommodate it. One way you accommodate it is by finding other people who agreed with you, with your views in the first place. If you get a lot of people who agree with you, then you must be right. And so that's why in evangelical churches, for example, it's very hard to break out, because everybody has the same view. And if you feel like breaking out, you get convinced, oh yeah, I guess I'm right because everybody else agrees with me. And so that happens within scholarship as well, because scholarly communities, they're not churches, but evangelical scholars are evangelical scholars, and that's who they associate with. And, it's the same thing with mythicists and with, atheists. It's a similar problem, but everybody has to figure out some way to try and bracket their assumptions and their beliefs when doing the kind of research we do.
Does bracketing religious belief and treating the Bible as an historical text say anything necessarily about one's religious conviction?
No, I don't think it should. I mean, I think historical findings may lead you to alter your faith. I, for the life of me, can't think of any historical reasons to leave the faith. I mean, I don't see any historical reason not to be a Christian. There might be moral grounds or philosophical grounds or other things, but historically, I mean, history is history. And so I've said this repeatedly on here, my close friends are my closest friends are two Presbyterian ministers who have PhDs in New Testament, who taught for 30 years historical critical studies of the New Testament, who agree with me on most things, and they're active in their church. they, they wouldn't believe what a lot of other Christians believe, maybe, but they still consider themselves Christian and are committed to it. So it doesn't have to destroy a person's faith.
My final question is looking again at this idea of divine inspiration and the Bible being inerrant. Do you think it's possible for an academic to hold that view of the biblical text and still conduct rigorous academic research? Or do you think that inerrancy part is a hurdle that has to be overcome?
It's a very tricky question. I just had an email exchange with somebody who does believe, a friend of mine for almost 40 years, over 40 years, who is a professor at a evangelical theological seminary, who absolutely believes in the inerrancy of the Bible and is involved in high-level scholarship. But my sense is that the kind of scholarship in biblical studies that you can do is limited if you believe that there can't be any errors at all. Because if you believe that and you're not willing to ever change your mind on it, then it precludes certain kinds of scholarship, but it allows for other kinds. When I was an evangelical, conservative evangelical, still committed to the inerrancy of the Bible, my decision was that I wanted to do my PhD working on analyzing ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, to see how the manuscripts, mainly the Greek manuscripts, differed from each other in places, to figure out why scribes changed the text when they did, and to figure out what the original authors wrote. That's an extremely rigorous form of scholarship in New Testament studies. It's not one most people pursue because it's really kind of detailed and picayune and like mind-boggling detailed and boring for most people. So most people don't do that. But it's a field that a lot of evangelicals go into because you're not forced to deal with things like contradictions in the Bible or theological differences or geographical mistakes or things like that. You're analyzing manuscripts, which you could do if you're studying Homer or Plato or something. And so it would have no bearing on whether you believe what's in there. And so it allowed, my idea was to do that so I could get credentialed, having a PhD and maintaining an evangelical view. So I would have the credentials to teach in a university without having to confront these kinds of issues. Another thing that a lot of scholars do in America, a lot of young scholars who graduate from college or from seminary, is they'll go to university, like in England, for example. There are a number of students who take degrees at Oxford or Cambridge or Edinburgh or whatever, because they don't have to take seminars. It's basically a matter of writing a dissertation, and then they pick a dissertation topic that they can do without having to kind of wrestle with a lot of these issues. I'm not saying everybody who goes to England for a PhD does this. I'm just saying this is one route that was open to me, that I thought serious about going to Cambridge to do that, and not to do textual criticism, but to do interpretation and to do that kind of thing. And that's a route people take. But I think really it's very hard, very hard.
What makes it hard for academics, Christian academics, specifically evangelical, more fundamentalist people, to do the kinds of study and research that you've gone on to do?
Well, they can, they certainly can. They can publish in the academic journals, and they do, and so that's all good. The problem is that I'll give you one example. When scholars study the writings of Paul, and they really want to know what Paul's theology was, for example, they limit themselves to the 7 letters that we're pretty sure Paul wrote, the 7 so-called undisputed Pauline letters. There are 6 other letters in the New Testament that are debated by scholars whether Paul wrote them, and the vast majority of critical scholars say no, Paul did not write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, for example. But evangelicals, conservative evangelicals, will say, well, of course he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And, they'll mount their arguments for it, and the other side will mount their arguments. But the reality is you probably I haven't really looked carefully. I don't think you could publish an article in one of the major international journals of biblical studies using First and Second Timothy and Titus to make an argument for what Paul really said, because the consensus is he didn't write those things, but you think that he did. And so, what evangelical scholars have to do in those situations is to just say, "Look, I think he wrote all 13, but I'm just going to stick to the 7." You see what I mean? So they can't really then explore things the way that others who take the critical consensus do. And so it creates certain problems. And I'll tell you, it's always been a problem with me when I've had PhD students who come in with a very strong view of the inerrancy of the Bible, just to get them to agree to do the kinds of things critical scholars do. I'm not forcing them to change their beliefs or anything, but it's like, if you've got to apply this method, this particular method, it requires you to have certain kinds of assumptions.
What kinds of methodologies require you to have that suspension of faith?
Well, if you think that the Gospels report things that Jesus did not really say, they have him say it. If it's very hard to develop criteria for establishing what Jesus actually said based on our sources, if you think that every word in the Gospels is what he said. Then your criterion then is you read the Gospels, but that's not doing your critical scholarship. So how do you even engage in it? You have to almost say, if I were doing this from a critical point of view, I would do it like this, something like that, I guess. I don't know. But so it does create problems. It'd be comparable. It's comparable to if somebody was a 6-day creationist who thought that the world was created in 6 days, sometime maybe 6,000 years ago. It'd be very hard for that person to get a PhD in geology, because, or somebody who believes that Adam and Eve were created as human beings and that they weren't descended from something else. They're not going to be able to get a degree in evolutionary biology, or whatever. And it's just because their assumptions are so contrary to the field. So that's the problem.
I see. Thank you. I think we will pause there, take a quick break, and then we'll be back with some news about your work and then some listeners' questions following that. Have you ever wondered where the New Testament Gospels really came from? Were the books actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as everyone seems to say? The answers to these questions may surprise you. In fact, what you discover may challenge everything you thought you knew about the Gospels. If you're ready to learn the historical truth, then you won't want to miss Bart Ehrman's free webinar, Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? In this 50-minute talk with Q&A, you'll learn answers to some of the most intriguing questions surrounding the Gospels' authorship, such as, why did early Christians say the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John if they're anonymous? What's the best evidence that the Gospels were written by the Apostles? Were the Apostles of Jesus educated well enough to write books? And last, if the Apostles did not write the Gospels, who did? And where did they get their information? Don't miss your chance to uncover the truth behind the Gospels. Sign up now for free lifetime access to Did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John at bartehrman.com/authors. Thank you. Welcome back. We are going to have a now quick update from Bart.
This is Bart's Weekly Update, where we get to catch up on all the latest about Dr. Ehrman's book releases, speaking engagements, ehrmanblog.org happenings, and online course launches.
So, Bart, we have about 2 weeks left until the New Insights in the New Testament conference kicks off. We've spoken about all of the speakers, and it's getting close.
It's getting close, and man, I'm getting a lot of good feedback about this thing because it's, as I've said before, I don't know why nobody's thought of this before. I guess just when COVID hit, we started realizing the possibilities of remote interactions, uh, and so there's never been anything like this where you get 10 world class scholars to talk about the Bible. They're real experts in the Bible and the New Testament Gospels in this case, talking to people on a lay level, so that they're going to be very highly intelligent talks, but they're going to be completely accessible to non-scholars, and all on different topics. And I'm really pumped because I haven't heard any of these talks myself, except I actually haven't even heard my talk. I'm talking about something I've never talked about before, and so I just think this is going to be great with Q&A, and there's going to be I don't know if we talked about this, Megan. There's going to be this follow-up session the weekend afterwards where I talk about the other people's talks.
Oh no, I didn't know that. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
That's going to be, so people can sign up for that too, where I'm going to go through. You're just going to talk about, kind of do my take on,
Mhm.
I'm not going to go after anybody's jugular or anything. I'm just going to be like, talk about, wow, that was, why that was interesting and important. And so there's a lot tied up in this thing, and I'm just really excited about it. I hope it goes. I think it'll go really well.
No, I think it will. And I wanted to ask you as well, in Assyriology, there's this kind of internal narrative that what we do is so esoteric that no one could possibly be interested in it. And my time on YouTube has shown me very conclusively otherwise. Is there that same sense in the academic study of the New Testament that actually this stuff is it's just not interesting to people outside the field?
I you know I think people who've never heard an interesting talk on it probably think that. A lot of people maybe have heard pastors try to explain something in a rather boring way, and it's kind of, oh God, okay, just get to the point and sort of thing. But when you hear a serious scholar actually get into what's the interesting stuff, you know. All of these topics are, if you're interested in the Bible, this is just interesting. And even if you don't know much about it, but you'd like to know something about it, um, I'm telling you, this is, if you're not interested, if you rather, be watching NASCAR or something, then that's fine. That's fine. But if you actually do have any interest in this material, this is going to be as good as it gets.
So this is for those who have missed the past several episodes where we've talked about this. This is the New Insights in the New Testament conference. It will be running September 23rd and 24th. There will be 10 scholars spread across those 2 days giving fantastic lectures, and you can listen back to previous episodes to get kind of the rundown of those. The cost is $59.95, and you can sign up at www.ntconference.org. You can also use the conference scratch that bit. You can also use the podcast discount code MJ Podcast to get a discount on your ticket price. So highly recommended. Lots of fun, very interesting, and that is the 23rd and 24th. So we're going to now have some listeners' questions before we wrap up for the day.
Now it's time for Questions from Listeners, where Bart answers real questions submitted by Misquoting Jesus fans. If you'd like to submit a question for future segments, please visit bartehrman.com/askbart.
All right. But I have chosen some questions that are not really about history, not really about the New Testament, but are about the study of it. I thought that was probably useful given the topic of today's conversation. So, first question. As a psychology graduate now in my 60s who has transitioned fairly frequently between agnosticism and Christianity, currently a believer, I'm very interested in the extent to which Bible scholars who identify as Christian allow themselves to seek divine intervention or inspiration in their studies, much like an evangelical preacher might do before delivering a sermon. Is this something you've given much thought to, and is this something that you consciously did when you were a believer?
That's a really good question. My sense of it is that does happen in evangelical circles with people who are deep believers in the inspiration of the Bible and in the need for the Holy Spirit to guide interpretation. That was the approach that we took when I was at Moody Bible Institute and at Wheaton. And you'd always pray for guidance, and you would assume that you needed the guidance. When I started going to Princeton Theological Seminary, a more mainline Presbyterian seminary, more historically oriented in its scholarship that wasn't done. Classes would often start with prayer, but they never had the kind of assumption that, that if the Spirit guides me, I'm going to find the truth here, because they realize that different scholars have different opinions about everything based on evidence. And so I don't think that it normally happens among critical scholarship. But I do think that it does happen in more conservative Christian circles.
Next question is asking about using software, computer software, for textual criticism. It says, do you specifically, but I suspect the questioner would also be interested to know if this is true across the field more generally. Do you use software to detect differences between manuscripts or construct and evaluate manuscript family trees?
The answer is that's become a dominant feature of the study of manuscripts now. When I was doing it, when I was learning to do this, there was no option of doing that at all. If you wanted to compare manuscripts to find out like where two manuscripts were different from each other, you had to do it on microfilm. There were these crusty old microfilms that we had to get from Germany, and you'd get a microfilm machine where you kind of crank things up, and you kind of go through till you got to wherever you're looking at John 13. You crank through till you get to John 13. You'd have to figure out what John 13 was, because you didn't have any way to get it. They don't have titles or chapter numbers or anything. You kind of go through it until you get there, and then you get some other manuscript. You do that, and then you compare word for word. Like you look here, you look there, you look there, you look there. Oh my God, that was complicated. And so, but starting in the 80s, late 80s, maybe early 90s, they did develop computerized ways of doing things, where you just had to read a single manuscript. You might do it on microfilm back then. Today, you don't need to do it on microfilm, but you would simply note where the manuscript had a difference from a standard text of some kind. So, and if you have enough manuscripts, that you would just enter the differences among the various you have the same standard text. Suppose you've got a Textus Receptus or a new printed New Testament text. If you do 10 manuscripts like that, where you just point out, well, this differs from the standard text here, and here this word, this phrase is, you just do that separately. The computer can immediately decide show where all the places are different, and can calculate the percentages of agreements and differences, and do all sorts of statistical analyses that we had to do by hand. I spent a lot of time adding up numbers doing my dissertation and comparing manuscripts. Oh God, that was painful. And now you don't have to do that at all.
I feel like Assyriology is catching up to that interest in computer aided study. There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with like computer assisted reading of cuneiform and translation and that kind of thing. It's really interesting.
Yeah, well, if you can get the computer to read the manuscript, then you're really onto something, because that saves some work.
You do then have to teach the computer how to read all of the handwriting.
Yeah, I know.
Which is
right.
a different thing entirely.
Tricky. Yeah.
Okay, final question. I am interested in learning Koine Greek. I'm wondering if Bart can recommend some resources for learning at home.
I'm afraid I don't really know. People do this, and there are lots of online resources to do it. My strong suggestion is that anyone who uses whatever online sources look most attractive to them, that they have somebody who can guide them through it, either just to ask questions of or to check their work. Most people who are learning Koine Greek are doing it for the study of the New Testament, because if you're in a classics department and you take introductory Greek, you don't learn Koine Greek. Normally you'd be learning Attic Greek, so classical Greek from the time of Aristophanes and Plato and that kind of thing. That back 4th, 5th century Athens, you learn that kind of Greek, which is different from Koine, not hugely different. But if you learn the Attic Greek, the classic Greek, you can read the Koine. If you learn the Koine, it's really hard to read the classical. It's hard to go that direction. Most people learn the Koine to be able to study the New Testament, and it means that often they're actually not learning Greek. They're learning something they call New Testament Greek. which is kind of, I mean, what that would even be like. I mean, it's like, it's like reading, I don't know, Charles Dickens, like David Copperfield. I'm learning David Copperfield English. So you just learn the words that are in that book, the grammar that's in that book. And so people should learn broadly Greek. But the problem is that it's very easy if you're doing it on your own to slip up and not know it. And you don't want to get bad habits doing that. I've taught myself a number of ancient languages, and I know how hard it can be. But I did that only after I had formal training in 3 of them. And so it's very hard. And so it's worth doing. It's absolutely worth doing. But my only it's a small recommendation is that you find somebody who can help you out and make sure you're doing it right. A lot of people get things wrong, and they then end up interpreting some verse in some crazy way, and they just don't know. They don't know.
Thank you very much. And Bart, before we finish for the week, would you mind just summarizing what we talked about?
Right. So we're talking about a very interesting topic about the basic issue is how does a person's biases affect their understanding of religious traditions, especially when they're studying their own religious tradition. If they're not in that tradition, does that handicap them because they don't really know it from the inside? But on the other hand, more germane to some of the things we're talking about, if somebody is deeply committed to the tradition, can they actually approach the study in some kind of disinterested way without their biases determining their conclusions? And I was trying to say that in fact, I think it's possible to try to bracket your views, your assumptions, but it's clear that most people don't. Even people who claim to, they don't. If you end up concluding exactly what you were assuming to begin with, then you might want to take a look, take a second look at the evidence. So those are the kinds of issues we're talking about of real importance for the study of the New Testament in particular, because historical scholarship presupposes that history is not founded on personal religious belief. It's founded on historical data.
Thank you so much, Bart. Thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. Audience, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast and make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember that you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.bartehrman.com. That code is also good for the New Testament conference as well, so please remember to use it if you're going to buy tickets. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week. Bart, what are we talking about next time?
Well, as listeners know, there are a lot of books that are not in the New Testament written by Christian scholars, ancient Christians, many of whom claiming to be apostles. And our next talk is going to be about one that's absolutely one of my favorites, the Gospel of Peter, which was discovered in the 19th century and is, man, it's a mind blower in some places. And so it's a gospel many people don't know, but they should. And it has a very interesting account of Jesus' death and resurrection. So that's what we'll be talking about.
Fantastic. Thank you all, and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.